Their leaders, most of them, terrorist regime they led, are now dead.
President Donald Trump addresses the nation on Iran. What does his speech really mean, and who was it intended for? To break it down and what it signals politically and strategically, we're joined by Republican strategist and host of the podcast Standpoint, Gabe Groisman.
The Iranian regime is not going to get anything from President Trump's statements. They can read tea leaves all day, track pizza boxes to the Pentagon, all the silliness that you see online of trying to understand what the strategy is of the United States.
Major developments out of the UAE. Authorities have arrested dozens of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps money changers in what may be one of the most significant blows yet to Tehran's sanctions-evasion network. The ripple effects could hit one of the regime's most critical economic lifelines. What does this mean for the Islamic Republic's finances? Joining us, Miad Maleki, former senior U.S. Treasury sanctions strategist and now senior fellow at the FDD, Daniel Roth, research director at United Against Nuclear Iran, and Mohammad Machine-chian, senior economic journalist at Iran International.
Bilateral Iran-UAE trade was somewhere between $16 billion and $28 billion in recent years.
They have found $9 billion worth of this Iran-related shadow banking transactions over the course of 2024.
8 to maybe $15 billion a year from Dubai only.
And finally, an Iran International special report, Iran's security and military forces moved personnel, weapons, and equipment into at least 70 civilian sites during the U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, exposing what appears to be a nationwide pattern of using public spaces for military purposes. The journalist behind the exclusive report, Azadeh Akbari, joins us.
Out of all of those 70 locations, the biggest portion was schools as well. So that was 34
Terrific.
Schools, which was shocking.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. One of the biggest blows to the Iranian regime may now be unfolding far from the battlefield, a strike at its economic lifeline. Joining us now is Miad Maleki, Daniel Roth, and Mohammad Machine-chian. Thank you all for being here. Miad, we'll start with you. The UAE has long been one of the key hubs through which the regime built sanctions evasions networks. Give us a sense of just how significant this is for Tehran's economic survival, for the IRGC, and for other entities as well, if you could tell us about that.
Sure. No, thanks for having me, Negar. I think it's very obvious that UAE, and from my perspective, having served in the Treasury Department for years and looking at Iran's sanctions evasion efforts, the UAE is not one of the many sanctions evasion hubs for Iran. I would call it the single most critical jurisdiction in the Iranian regime's sanctions evasion architecture. When Dubai is disrupted, the Iranian regime, Tehran, would feel very quickly, immediately, the pressure, the economic pressure. Now, to be clear, the formal banking system in UAE and in Dubai, they have in place very robust compliance programs. The issue here is the Iranian regime and IRGC have found ways to exploit this open market kind of perspective or structure in Dubai and UAE to benefit as they have, through sham privatization in Iran, kicked out or isolated ordinary Iranians or businesswomen in Iran to set up businesses and be involved in Iran's economy through fair competition. They've been kicked out of Iran. They found UAE to be that market for them to establish businesses and work. And I'm talking about ordinary Iranians. Now, the regime exploited that process and really established some robust sanctions evasion systems throughout Dubai, free zones, and exchange houses, sarafis in Dubai and beyond. Well, in the government for years, we tried to work with Emiratis, with the UAE government, to push back on regime's sanctions evasion efforts in Dubai. They were cooperating, they were working with the US government, but it's really difficult for Emiratis to have this concept of free market and flourishing business in different industries and sectors, but at the same time pushback against regimes and IRGC's exploitation activities in Dubai and beyond, which is done through trusted agents, through front companies and shell companies that they've established for years. Now, at this point, what I'm seeing happening here is that the UAE government is really isolating all Iranian type activities, regardless of if it's regime related or IRGC or ordinary Iranians. Unfortunately, Iranians now also becoming the victim of regimes, sanctions evasion and illicit conduct beyond Iran and in Dubai now.
So they're doing it now. Is it because before either were they turning a blind eye, or they, like you said, it has now, collective punishment, if you will, and they were trying to avoid this collective punishment?
So that's the best way to actually articulate my point. But really, there are a couple points here to look at. One, there's a significant portion of Dubai's economy that is tied to Iranian origin type activities, whether it's petroleum or petrochemical exports that are done outside or out of Dubai or from Dubai, that are connected to Iranian crude oil or petrochemical production. Same with metals. So really, Emiratis, I wouldn't say they didn't have an intent to disrupt Iranian regime activities, but it would have been economically and from a security perspective very costly for them if they wanted to really go after Iranian regime or Iranian activities in Dubai and in UAE as a whole. So at this point, given the fact that there's no security concern anymore, listen, when we're engaging with Emiratis for years, or we're saying, listen, they're our neighbors. They're right next door. You guys are thousands of miles away. And we just have to find that right balance here when it comes to sanctions enforcement. At this point, they're being targeted by the Iranian regime anyways. Yeah. So there are more incentives right now for them to increase pressure on the Iranian regime, either to change their behavior and push them away from UAE shore and what they're doing in Hormuz, in Strait of Hormuz, or that maybe they just have a real intent of helping U.S. and Israeli efforts to change regime in Tehran.
Wow. Just before we move on to our other guests, I'm just curious, how much was the UAE making, the Emiratis making off the Iranian regime then, like ballpark?
There are many different numbers. Bilateral Iran-UAE trade was somewhere between $16 billion and $28 billion in recent years. The Iranian non-oil exports alone being somewhere around $6 to $7 billion annually. Now, this does not include the informal Iranian activities in UAE. These are the numbers that were released either by the Iranians or by Emiratis. So this doesn't account for the shadow banking activities that is done through front companies that are set up in UAE. Usually the connections to Iran is nothing. There are no Iranian hands or fingerprints over these companies. There are third country nationals, Indians and Pakistani nationals who are running these companies. And you have an Emirati national who is only on paper as the owner of the company. But the activities really is led by Iranian petrochemical, petroleum, or metals businessmen.
So that's still happening then?
Oh, it's been happening for years, still ongoing for sure.
But it's not part of the crackdown, is what I mean.
It's unclear. I think we've got to wait and see the extent of the crackdown. If it's only has to do with the current crackdown, looking at your really great reporting that came out, whether it's really limited to IRGC's foreign currency procurement activities in Dubai, which is significant, or it goes beyond that, and they're going after Iranian connected companies in free zones that are basically helping the Iranian regime to export petroleum, petrochemical products.
And Mohammed, as an economist, give us an idea, economically speaking, how much is the Iranian regime set to lose in this process? Keeping in mind that, like Miad mentioned, we still don't know the full extent, but based on what we know.
Well, on a good day, I can say when, for example, oil barrel is about $70, $75, and they're exporting about 1.5 million, 1.2 to 1.5 million barrels a day. they have an annual oil revenue about $50 billion. Around half of that, I would say, goes for the overhead, for the sanctioned merchants. Some of it is used as collateral held by the Chinese for barter of Chinese goods and services. So about, I would say, maybe half of that may end up in Dubai to be laundered, to be settled, to be converted into US dollars, to support, especially to sustain Rial at the current situation. And if you like, I can get into that as well,
Sure.
because that is becoming increasingly more vital for the regime in Iran to hold on to dear life as they are right now.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Oh, absolutely. So basically, that Iran is moving increasingly faster toward dollarization. So the value of Iranian Rial has been free falling for some time now. After the 12-day war, basically, Iranian Rial lost half of its value. The same pattern is expected to happen after the current war, at least. That is a very conservative estimate. If that happens, the Iranian central bank needs all the hard cash they can get their hands on. And they have basically three channels, one in Herat, one in Erbil, but the most important, to Mr. Maleki's point, has been Dubai. So basically that was their most critical, as I remember you put it, point for the Iranian central bank to get their hands on US dollars, basically. So all in all, I think it's fair to estimate around $8 to maybe $15 billion a year from Dubai only. That is definitely increasing in the current situation. We know even after the closure of Strait of Hormuz, they have been exporting oil. They continue to export oil. And of course, US allows them to export oil because to ease the supply pressure, of course. And the price, of course, has increased. We're talking about close to $100 a barrel right now for above 2 million barrels a day. So in this scenario, they're expected to lose much more, maybe between at least 15 to $20 billion.
Wow, that is significant. And Daniel, in North America, a large amount of Iranian money is laundered through Dubai. We can often trace the activity back to there, even if it wasn't necessarily the final destination. So with this, will this severely disrupt the regime's ability to move illicit money to Western countries? And to what extent, Daniel?
Well, Naga, pleasure to join you and your esteemed guests. This kind of all exploded in a very public way, actually a few months ago, when the Financial Crime Enforcement Network published a really fascinating and eye-opening report back in October 2025, and that kind of blew the lid off what many people had known about this shadow banking network. They assessed that ultimately they had found $9 billion worth of this Iran-related shadow banking transactions over the course of 2024. And obviously, that is only a snapshot of the full figure, which is probably, magnitudes or probably 10 times that. Probably, I would guess 10 times that. Within that reporting, as you mentioned, it does touch upon the US big banks. I'm not sure if it was in the report, but even JP Morgan, Standard Chartered, two names that regularly appear in Iran sanctions-related news. They have been touched by this because they have to provide these correspondent US banking accounts. Oil obviously is dollar denominated in most part, and that's why they have to have these big investments coming from big Western banks, including in the US. But the more direct node was, as you say, Dubai, because, as Miad kind of referred to before, it's a matter of geography, it's proximity to Iran, it's the fact that there are between 500,000 and 800,000 Iranians actually living or resident in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, and that's 1 in 12, up to 1 in 12 of Emiratis or residents are actually Iranian. So there's this whole pre-existing demographic that is, available to IRGC agents. And then I think, as one of your guests said, I can't remember, said they're using, Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankans also to set up these shell companies, these front companies. So very, very sophisticated way that the Iranians have tried to evade sanctions, sell its oil, and more than that, even procure these export controlled goods coming into Iran. It all connects, and it does touch upon the US financial system too.
But to what extent? Like just how is this going to prevent them from doing this, or is it going to make things harder for them? Like you said, that they've got other options in front companies. Like what kind of other alternatives are there, if any, at this point?
Well, it's to be determined how far the Emirati authorities are going to go on this. I think it's clear from your reporting that the exchange houses are going to be the first to be cracked down upon. Anything that's clearly IRGC related. But as I say, it's been a sophisticated operation to the extent that anybody working in just the general compliance AML unit, say in the West, wouldn't necessarily know that this is, there are obvious red flags. Like if it says Iran, I work for United Against Nuclear Iran, and often if there are transactions with us, we get flagged because it actually says the word Iran.
Iran,
But,
yeah.
if I'm going to be a little bit more clever than that, and obviously I'm going to use a name like some generic name, some boilerplate name. I'm sure, Miad knows all about this chap Shamkhani, his company Admiral. That's a very generic boilerplate kind of name that wouldn't necessarily raise any red flags. But the Dubai environment or the financial system, it is quite opaque. It's similar to the other two jurisdictions mentioned in that report from October 2025, Hong Kong, Singapore. Very easy to start up a business. In terms of the registries, as I say, they're quite opaque. Ownership is difficult to determine. A little bit unlike, in contrast to the UK, where you can just go on Companies House and determine that kind of thing quite easily. So the question, how far, is really to be determined, but I think a very good step from the Emiratis thus far.
And yet, how much does the regime still rely on Turkey, for example, Iraqi Kurdistan, Afghanistan?
Yeah, not nearly as. Sorry, that was a question for
No,
Daniel.
go ahead, Miad. I know
Yeah.
you jump on this one.
Yeah, of course. I don't think it's nearly as much as, they're benefiting from their access to the UAE market. Obviously, Turkey has been for years a key jurisdiction for Iran's foreign currency procurement, access to some of the formal financial sectors or formal financial institutions across Europe, and also gold procurement that Iran has been engaging in Turkey. There's the difference between Turkey and UAE is that Turkey has actually the land access to the Iranians. So there's Iranians tend to travel to Turkey a lot. And as I mentioned, this Islamic Republic is really, their strategy has always been using Iranians as human shield, both in the battlefield, as they've done since the Iran-Iraq war until today, and also in the financial economic activities. They tend to use ordinary Iranians as human shields. So they travel to Turkey, they exchange Rial and other currencies to US dollars, and they bring it back. And they do the same thing with gold. And they've been doing that for years. But also there's a real estate market for the Iranian regime officials that have invested in that market in a way to move their capital and assets outside Iran's economy, and especially real estate market in Iran that is not that stable and promising as the Turkey real estate market is.
And Mohammed, what is this going to do to the Islamic Republic's ability to finance its proxies and to its repressive apparatus at home? Is this going to be a meaningful cutoff?
Well, what would expect so, but their activities in 2025 proves otherwise. Because in 2025, they got very close to collapse. At the same time, they funded at least, we know of, $1 billion to Hezbollah alone. So the situation definitely has worsened since last year. And it's downhill from here. I cannot foresee any other way around it. But nonetheless, proxies seem to remain on top of the priority list of the junior Ayatollah as well. At the same time, the pressure definitely will increase in the coming months in Tehran. As mentioned before, they are desperately trying to basically keep Rial alive. And now that Dubai channel is no more accessible, at least not for the foreseeable future, I think that the other alternative channels will become increasingly more important, and they will rely on those channels as well. One point that Mr. Maleki touched on was the procurement of gold. And this has been one of the ways that Iranian central bank has been basically funding Rial by selling gold, basically gold coins. And as Rial is becoming hot and Iranian people are turning to other stores of value, gold is, of course, very attractive, and they have high reserves of gold, the central bank does. And the procurement of gold, especially in 2024 and 2025, increased significantly. So they still have reserves in gold, even though we know that their foreign currency reserves are basically depleting and are almost empty at this point.
And Daniel, just to conclude, politically speaking, what are the ramifications here? Can the Iranian regime ever rebuild its relationship with the UAE after this? I mean, historically they had ties. Of course, as we've noted, they've built networks for sanctions evasion. And for the UAE, the strategic and the political value in all of this, does this outweigh whatever financial benefit they were receiving from the Iranian regime, in your view?
Yeah, the geopolitical angle is really fascinating, and it does waver really depending on how strong the United States is with its relationship with Iran. I mean, we saw UAE, similar to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, really hedging during the Biden years. You know, as soon as Joe Biden came into office, the first thing they did in terms of foreign policy was remove that sanctions designation on the Houthis. So that was a real message, not only to the Iranians that we're going to go into appeasement mode now for the next 4 years, but it was a clear message to the Saudis and to the Emiratis that we don't have your back so strongly. The UAE is a tiny country, is 10 million. It's about 100 miles, 75 miles to the nearest part of Iran, extremely vulnerable. So it's rational that it does have to hedge, but that's less of a risk, if we're talking from a US perspective, if America is strongly on the side of protecting and being very tough on Iran. And that doesn't mean what I'm afraid the Biden administration were doing, which was, as far as I could tell, just simply trying to ride it out, kick the can down the road and appease. So I think the UAE has decided over the last month, having received, I think, in excess of 1,000 missiles and drones, that enough is enough. And I would say it does take some courage, perhaps belated, but the fact that they're also hinting at partaking in military action as well, it's certainly admirable.
But what about Iran's calculus here, Daniel? What were they thinking? Did they not expect the UAE to be so bold and courageous, like you said?
A couple of days in, my analysis was that Iran had made quite a big strategic miscalculation, but it was in lieu of many other options, really. What can they do if you're looking at their military capacities? What do they have? Well, they've got the region's biggest ballistic missile arsenal and the region's biggest drones arsenal. They don't have an air force to speak of. The navy, as we've seen, has been destroyed quite promptly. So the initial idea from the Iranians was to attack Saudi, attack UAE, attack Qatar, US partners and allies, let's say partners, and then pressure the US to lean on Israel and itself to stop. That was all Iran had. It really didn't have many other options. But in terms of the Emirati response, as I say, courageous, a little bit belated. I think the Saudis could potentially follow suit as well. There's only so much of this kind of thing that they can take, especially as Iran is obviously attacking civilians, infrastructure. They've killed Saudis, they've killed Emiratis, they've killed other foreign nationals in those countries. But as I say, I do express my admiration for the Emirates and the announcement and the cracking down on the exchange houses, etc.
Yeah, certainly a big miscalculation on Tehran's part. Is there anything else to all our guests that you guys would like to add that we haven't touched on?
I would just add, Iran is very economically integrated in UAE. I mean, you're thinking about 47 years of economic oppression by this regime in a way that if you wanted to operate as an independent, you wanted to run an independent business, if you had great ideas, but you were not connected to the regime, if you didn't want to work with the regime, then UAE was one place to go. Given the Iranian passport lost its value very quickly in the 80s. So UAE became really a business hub for the Iranians, and an Iranian regime, as I said, exploited that very quickly. Now, there are elements of Iranian regime's activities in UAE that really go beyond petroleum, petrochemical exports, metals exports, or foreign currency exchange or conversion, or real estate. There are also construction type connections that exist between the two countries. For example, there's a company called General Mechanic Company. It's owned by Miad Maleki, one of the foundations that falls under the Supreme Leader's office. General Mechanic Company has branches, I think a couple offices in UAE. They're openly, with some research, you can find their connections or the ownership that ties back to Miad Maleki, the Supreme Leader's office. They have been building roads and bridges in Sharjah, in different parts of UAE. And there are definitely different type of connections between Iran and UAE that would really go beyond the scope of what Emiratis are doing these days in connection with the current conflict. So if this conflict ends and we will end up with Islamic Republic that continue to survive and keep things together in Iran, then I can see how UAE would have to reconsider and open up its market back to the Iranian regime. But if we end up with a different type of regime, a government that is more representative of the Iranians, I think you're going to also see some concern in UAE when it comes to what extent the Iranian investments and financial activity is going to shift back to Iran, go to places like Kish Island, this economic potential that Iran offers that now have been housed in UAE that might go back to Iran. So Emiratis have a lot of thinking to do here, whether it's the Islamic Republic, whether it's in Iran, a different government, and how that's going to affect their state of economy.
Of course, and the Iranian pride always kicks in, right? So for how many years I've been hearing that Kish could have been what the UAE is right now. Thank you so much to all of our guests for joining us today, for your time and for your expertise.
Thank you.
To dig deeper into President Trump's Iran address, we're joined by Gabe Groisman, host of the podcast Standpoint and Republican political strategist. Gabe, welcome to Eye for Iran.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I understand there's Houthi missile attacks right now in the background, so thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's been a wild day. I'm in Jerusalem, and I live in Miami, but I'm here in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover holiday because the terrorists are not my travel agents. So we're here, and we've been running back and forth, unfortunately, today to the shelter, I think 3 times. There's missiles today actually coming from all 3 places all over Israel, from Hezbollah in the north, we have from the Houthis, and from Iran. So it's kind of coming from everywhere, but the alert system is, honestly, it's fantastic, and it's a sad reality, but the Israelis are resilient people. It's incredible.
And you've got the right spirit. That's the important thing. And Gabe, let's talk about President Trump's speech to the nation on Iran. Was it what you expected? Let's get into your reaction to start.
Yeah, listen, President Trump has actually been very clear about the goals of the war, what he's trying to accomplish, and what has been happening. It's a confusing statement for people hearing that sometimes because the media hasn't covered it that way. Many times the media kind of take the same thing he says and turn it into whatever they want it to be. But his statement was, look, of course, one part of us, of I think all of us want at some point for him to say, our goals have been achieved. Iran has been decapitated. The IRGC can no longer threaten its people, can no longer threaten the region, can no longer threaten Israel. The Strait of Hormuz is open. Everything is great, right? He's not there yet. He says most of our objectives have been accomplished. But then he said, this is going to take 2 or 3 more weeks, and he gave a very aggressive statement. Now, look, we're likely, when I read between the lines, it's clear that there are negotiations happening, whether negotiations or messaging back and forth. That's the only pushback you're hearing, but, it's one and the same. And there are discussions happening, but the Iranian government, the IRGC in particular, need to understand that the U.S. is not going to stop and Israel is not going to stop. And it's a unique situation for people to realize because both the United States and the Israeli Air Forces have full operational control over Iran. They're doing whatever the heck they want, right? So the Iranians can act like they're negotiating, can act like they have some cards, but they really don't. And I think that's what we saw. We saw strength and resolve from the president. I was very proud of him, and I say proud because, honestly, in this time as an American Jew, seeing both my country, the United States of America, and the land of my people, the land of Israel, the state of Israel, fighting side by side in such a level of strength and such a show of strength consistently throughout this battle over the last 30-something days, I thought was critical. Or is critical.
And how did you view, as a strategist, how did you view President Trump's tone?
Yeah, I actually think he got it just right. Look, the president, when you analyze the way he delivers the messages, you can almost put him into 2 categories, right? One is when he has a planned speech, when he's sitting with his team, he thinks through, what is it that I want to say? What's the message I want to deliver? And then the other is the sort of the off-the-cuff, just spitting out what he wants to say, which is also people have learned to interpret those things, and they have the impact most of the time that he wants, which we're learning. It took America and I think the world a while to realize his style and what he's actually trying to deliver. Yesterday was the former, right? That speech that he gave was a planned speech. The message was clear and specific of what the U.S. was trying to deliver. He also gave a speech to the American people, some tones there, some words there specifically to the Republican Party, those who are upset in a way of the U.S. getting involved in another war. It's a small minority. It's less than 15% of the Republican Party if we're averaging out the polls that are out there. But he said, I'm going to paraphrase the numbers, right? But I'll just use general numbers. How about that, right? World War II took X amount of time. World War I took X amount of time. This is 32 days. We're 32 days in, and we've done the most damage you've ever seen in this amount of time in the past. Let's put things in perspective. This is an operation, and it's going to be done in a couple weeks, and we're going to accomplish our goals. I thought that was a very important message for the American people, not only those that are opposing him, but people want to know, right? This is costing a lot of money. Gas prices are up. That is a real thing in America. People talk about that. It impacts the economy. Elections are right around the corner, right? So his messaging was very well balanced from my perspective, both a strong message to the IRGC saying, we're coming after you. We're going to blast you back to the Stone Ages, I believe is what his statement was, right? Amongst other things, but also saying he's going to be done in a couple weeks, and putting that comparison between this operation and those larger wars, saying, look, don't compare those things. This is something totally different.
So like you mentioned, I mean, he talked about how he feels that this is going to conclude, like you said, in a couple of weeks, talked about some of the military successes that he's had against the Iranian regime. And, the interesting thing for me, Gabe, is, I've talked to a lot of analysts, and I can see this, is that they say that sometimes Trump uses like a deliberate strategic ambiguity, but for a purpose. There's it's tactical and there's strategy behind it. At one moment, he's threatening to obliterate the Iranian regime, like you said, Stone Age, and the next he's speaking of a ceasefire and peace. But in a way, could that be deliberate to keep your adversaries from guessing? Because why would the president of the most powerful military in the world, one of the most powerful nations, lay out all their cards in a speech, right? Could that have been an attempt to maybe throw the Iranian regime off guard, like, hey, this is going to finish in a few weeks. Hey, we've already dealt with, I mean, he said something like along the lines of, well, there's been regime change because there's different people within the regime. But I mean, would that in some ways fool the Iranian regime so that they will be caught off guard and that there's something deliberate behind it? What do you think that fits into that strategic framework?
So I think it's absolutely deliberate. I think you have to tie it to the statements that the president has been saying for the last couple days, or maybe for the last week, which is we're almost done. He keeps saying we're almost done. We've almost reached our mission. At the same time, you have our Secretary of War, Hetzek, saying the opposite, and Rubio saying the opposite. All of that is deliberate. And then, the regime may think, okay, they're almost done now. This was the end. And he said, no, we're going to have 2 or 3 more weeks where we're going to blast you into oblivion or whatever, paraphrasing. It's absolutely strategic. And I think when you were speaking, it made me think of the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2, right? Trump in his first term and Trump now. In the first term, the world almost entirely would think that he had no plan. He's just off the cuff. He's just doing whatever he wants, right? And those of us who supported him would push back against it. I think no serious analyst will tell you that Trump is shooting from the hip, right? This is all planned and strategic. You may or may not agree with this plan. I personally agree with it entirely. I think to bring freedom to the Iranian people, to bring peace to the region, to finally cut the Iranian regime at its knees, at its weakest point, right? We have to learn. I'm sorry to shift the topic a little bit. I think we have to learn. I've been in Israel for the last 5 days now, and I come here often, but to come here now in the middle of this war, here they call it a war, there they call it an operation, but for Israel, it's part of the larger October 7th war. People are getting the north today, for example, in Israel, since last night through today, they've been in bomb shelters nonstop. Yep. Back and forth to the bomb shelters. Tel Aviv, the same. Jerusalem, the south from the Houthis. But if you speak to people, right, left, or center, everybody knows what's going on. Everybody's supportive of the war. Everybody understands that there's a small price to pay for there to be quiet and peace in the region, here in Israel, for the Iranian people, for everyone else in the Western Hemisphere, right, or in the Western world more specifically, right? So I think as Americans and other people around the world, we have to understand that. We have to understand the goal and the purpose of this war, and the president is laying that out clearly in his statements. It's absolutely strategic to keep their enemies on their toes. If the president were to say, hey, we're done in 2 days, which, by the way, we've seen in other conflicts in the Middle East, and where there's a ceasefire said in 2 days, and everyone fights towards a ceasefire, the president is making it clear, like, there is no negotiation. Like Pete Hegseth says, the secretary says, we're negotiating with bombs. The United States is going to continue to negotiate, but from a very, very strong position of strength.
So keeping on that thread of that strategic framework in general, and you mentioned that this was to the American audience, but in some ways, is this also to the Iranian regime, again, to confuse them?
Yeah, absolutely. The Iranian regime is not going to get anything from President Trump's statements. They can read tea leaves all day, track pizza boxes to the Pentagon, all the silliness that you see online of trying to understand what the strategy is of the United States and Israel. But the truth is, the IRGC is in shambles. The regime is in shambles. I'm sure their intelligence apparatus is entirely in shambles. Yes, they're still shooting missiles. That's something that, Americans and Europeans and the rest of the world need to understand. They're still shooting out these intercontinental ballistic missiles. They're landing here, right? And even when they're intercepted by the Iron Dome or other defensive capabilities, they fall in many pieces down. And when you have big pieces of hot metal falling down the size of school buses, they're just as dangerous or almost as dangerous as a missile itself.
Of course.
Right? So there are prices to pay, but the Iranian regime is not going to get messages or be able to get an understanding of what the U.S. strategy is from the president's speech, and that's by design.
And when it comes to, when it comes to the idea of regime change, I recently watched an interview that you did with Marco Rubio on your podcast. I recently hosted Senator Cruz on my podcast. And I mean, they both talked about regime change. And they both really understand the threat of the Iranian regime. The Israelis understand the threat of the Iranian regime, that making, having a ceasefire with people who may not be the previous regime folks are still just as ideological as the next. They could stall during Trump's presidency and then up their game in a couple of years because time is of a different essence in the Middle East, as you know. So what did you make of his statement on regime change within his speech?
First of all, Secretary Rubio said, I think yesterday or the day before, clearly said it's never been our goal for there to be regime change. It's not one of our military objectives, to use his words precisely. Of course, that's the hope, right? The hope is that the Iranian people will rise up, or there'll be a military coup that'll turn on themselves or on each other, which I think is the more likely of the two, because we know I'm sure your audience knows very well, right, how they've shot down protesters or anyone that's even tried to raise their voice at all at levels they're really hard to fathom, and the world really needs to focus on more. So I think there's really a balance there, right? The U.S. Has tried regime change in the last 20 years, 30 years. It doesn't necessarily work well. It's not popular politically. The results kind of speak for themselves. So if we want to talk about regime change for a little, if we have a couple of minutes, we can look at what the U.S. is doing in other countries, right? If we look at Venezuela, for example, the U.S. tried a brand new strategy that's almost unheard of, at least in American politics. And it's I'm hard pressed to find another example of this where the U.S. found someone else, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, basically anointed her president, right? And said, as long as you're working with us, you'll be president. If not, you'll be in jail next to Maduro in New York City, right? And she's doing that. And the reason they did that, people were upset about that. They didn't understand what the strategy was. But the strategy was there, which will help us understand the strategy here. The strategy there was, let's not allow this to devolve into a civil war, into full chaos there between cartels and different drug groups that are going to take over, right? There is no strong military that can block it. It'll be a mess. So let's try to work with them to bring them to a better place through them. Now, Iran is very different, right? You hear the president now with that background saying, it kind of is regime change because the guys who are there are no longer with us, right? Because the U.S. and Israel have taken them out. So they're trying to figure out what's going to be next, but the U.S. definitely is not in the business of regime change. Israel's not in the business of regime change, but they are setting the conditions. We've heard Prime Minister Netanyahu speak over and over to the Iranian people saying, this is your moment, right? Everyone knows how difficult and how dangerous that is, but trying to create the conditions and the pressure for there to be some sort of regime change. I'll note for your audience, if you can hear it or not, we're in Jerusalem, and you hear the calls for prayer, the muezzins in the background. 5 times a day, you hear it here. You'll hear lots of people talk about apartheid state and all this nonsense, but these are our neighbors. They live in the same city with the same rights of everybody else here in Jerusalem. 5 times a day, even in the middle of the night, you get their calls for prayer. So just a side note from the background noise.
No, thank you. And thank you for explaining it, because you can kind of hear like a muffled sound. So people might not know exactly that it is the call to prayer. So thank you for setting the scene for us there. And one of the big unanswered questions now is the Strait of Hormuz. What are your thoughts on, on one hand, he said it will open up naturally. And then he said, actually, we're going to get the neighbors to do something about it. It's their business. So what do you think there?
Look, the Straits of Hormuz clearly are a critical part of this war. Right, that's the economic engine. That's the economic lever that Iran is trying to pull, and I say trying to pull because when the world turns its attention to it, which they're doing now, and we're trying to figure out, the United States, trying to figure out, how many military assets to put there versus focusing on other efforts in the war, right? Because one pushes the other, right? If the regime falls, for example, we don't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz, which is what Trump is trying to say when he says it'll open up automatically. Look, it's a critical thing. I think the United States could definitely use help. Not that the U.S. cannot do it on its own. You hear media saying that. Of course, the U.S. can open up the Straits of Hormuz on its own, but everything costs money. There's NATO in the background of, where are our NATO partners? Why are the NATO partners not out here supporting? You have the Gulf states who have been attacked in some cases, like the UAE, more than Israel has been attacked, and they still haven't really been involved in the war in any offensive manner. The Europeans are just speaking, and even the ones who said they're going to participate aren't doing anything. So part of it is the U.S. trying to push its allies to do something. But I also think, the allyship between the United States and Israel has never been highlighted more than now, right? Because the only country who's out there fighting with the U.S. is Israel without asking really any questions, just being supportive of the U.S.'s efforts and vice versa. But to be specific, the Straits of Hormuz have to open up, right? The Iranians cannot have a stronghold there. They can't be charging a toll like they've been doing, as if there's some sort of mafia on the streets of Colombia, right? That's not okay. We're talking about the world economy. Even though the U.S. doesn't get its oil from there, the majority of that goes to the rest of the world. It does impact directly the oil markets, which impacts the U.S., impacts everybody else in the world, frankly. So that's a key element. They're not saying that that's critically. They're not saying that that is a goal or an objective of the war, but I do think it's baked into the other objectives.
And the UAE might join in too on that fight, which is pretty significant, as they take steps to crack down on all the sanctions evasion networks that the Iranian regime has created, and which they've invested in the country. So this is a big deal.
Yeah, listen, absolutely. I'm waiting to see the UAE and Saudi and these other countries, especially those who signed the Abraham Accords, stand up and do something. They have military, they have the assets, they haven't used them, right? So think about like Saudi Arabia, where they have a very large military, very large air force, but I don't know the last time we've seen them flying any real operations. So part of it is that, but it's also very, very interesting from a geopolitical perspective, because this shift, this war, this operation, whatever we'd like to call it, is really pushing forward. It's almost fast forwarding what was to come after the Abraham Accords, of the shift in the region of the nations that are trying to work together economically, they're trying to work together politically from a defense perspective. Doesn't mean that everyone has to agree on every issue, right? The big issue was, do we have to resolve the quote unquote Palestinian issue before talking to the Gulf states? That was, the answer was always yes, until Jared Kushner came around with President Trump the first time around and said, no, let's put that aside and resolve everything else we can, right? I think our Gulf partners probably thought this was going to be a process of 10 or 20 years. But this war today with Iran, this operation from the U.S.'s perspective with Iran, them being hit directly by missiles on a daily basis, in some cases, by
And
Iran.
killed.
Yeah, and getting killed. It's time for them to step up, and I hope they do, really more from a geopolitical perspective and what that means for the alliances between these countries than from the military support that they could give.
You made a really interesting point, because when you look at October 7th, that was one of the biggest miscalculations on the part, geopolitically speaking, of the Iranian regime. Because it's my understanding from an exclusive I had back in 2024, where I learned from somebody connected to the State Department, was that there was an official working within Biden's administration who was kind of revealing a little bit too much. The Saudis were getting ready to sign the Abraham Accords with Israel. And Hamas and, of course, the Iranian regime got word of this and launched October 7th to try and prevent that, which initially it did work, but I mean, only for a certain time, right?
Yeah, when you say October 7th was a miscalculation, it's going to go down as the biggest political miscalculation or military miscalculation, or both, in history. Because when Sinwar decided to launch the bloodiest attack against Jews since the Holocaust, I get chills just saying those words. Very connected to many people there on October 7th and the time thereafter. And just when they did that, they're in their dreams, right? In their plans, in their dreams, this was going to be another one of the wars where Hezbollah was going to attack from the north. Iran was going to start launching missiles like they are now, and everybody just froze, right? Israel ran its troops to the northern border before they ran to Gaza. Most people don't know that, on October 7th in the morning, because the fear was Hezbollah was going to start launching a huge ground attack like what came out of Gaza from Hamas.
And there was plans. There was actual plans that they were to do that was part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plans. If you could see them, it's incredible to hear conspiracy theorists speak because they've never seen the documents. The Nukba terrorists that were there they had plans in their pockets of how to get to Jerusalem, how to get to Tel Aviv. The Al-Quds terrorists, I'm sorry, and the plan was to get there, and from the Hezbollah terrorists to come down from the north and to meet in the middle and take over Israel. Obviously, that didn't happen. The Saudis did retreat, right? As you mentioned, the Saudis did retreat politically from Israel. They started making, the foreign minister and others started making statements that were really heavy-handed when it came to Israel compared to MBS, and statements coming from him, from the Crown Prince. But as you said very clearly, things started to change. And when bombs started falling, missiles started falling in the skies of Saudi Arabia, right, from Iran, they remembered, hopefully, what they were trying to do when they were bringing forward the Abraham Accords, and why the alliance with this side of the ledger of the United States and Israel and the Western world, what it brings to their nation, what it brings to their people, right? And that's peace and prosperity.
Going back to Trump's speech, when he talked about his allies in the region, he didn't talk about Oman. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Listen, it's the same situation we're hearing from other states in the region. A lot of talk and not a lot of action. So the president is very focused. If you focus on, if you pay attention to what he says, many people get a little distracted by the personal part, right? Because he'll personalize international relations in a way that people get confused. Oh, he only supports Israel because of Bibi. Obviously that's garbage. Of course, because of his relationship with Netanyahu, he's able to do things he couldn't do maybe with a different prime minister or vice versa. But it's obviously a larger relationship than an individual relationship. But the way the president deals with his foreign policy many times is on that personal level. He's not going to do what other presidents have done, which is tip their hat to other world leaders, to other countries, because it's what they're supposed to do, right? Because that's what the foreign policy experts in the State Department, with quotes around the word experts, are telling him to say, right? He's going to call out the countries who are standing with the United States in a negative way, and call out the ones who are actually standing beside the United States in a positive way. And today, really, that's frankly only Israel.
And, you talked about earlier the two versions of Trump. You've got teleprompter Trump, which is more presidential, and then you've got, another side of him that he kind of goes off script. And definitely Wednesday evening, like you said, we saw the presidential version of him. Even despite that, did you, in terms of the language used, did you see it as being kind of escalatory in nature? Because, he didn't talk about that we're going to negotiate something. He could have used that opportunity to kind of bring down the heat, but he didn't. So why is that?
If anyone needs to ask, they should read The Art of the Deal and understand how the president negotiates. He's not going to negotiate by going on international television and saying, hey, let's get together, sit around the table, it's time to reach a deal. That's something you might have heard from President Biden or President Obama in the past. That's not President Trump. It doesn't mean he's not having side deals, side discussions. His team is not having side discussions. But when I say he's going to negotiate from a position of strength, he's going to do that. Now, you asked if it's escalatory. I think that was a specific question. I don't. I think it was actually consistent and measured. When you asked earlier about what I thought about the messaging, and that's really it. It was consistent and measured. That is the speed, that is the pace by which the United States has been approaching this operation in Iran, right? And it's almost full speed ahead. There's always room. I say almost because it seems like there's always room to push the gas a little bit more, which is what he was doing, right? But that's that same toggle switch that he's been on, that same spot that he's been on throughout the war. And I think that's what the Iranians were looking for, right? Is he going to come out and say, all right, basta, right? I'm done.
Yeah.
The U.S. wants, we won, with a banner in the back. Congratulations, mission accomplished, right? And then they're going to say they won and they'll shoot some more missiles for 2 days. Like that was the U.S. of yesterday. Right, when the U.S. of today, when people are supportive of the president like I am, when he talks about make America great again, right, what that means, this is what it means, right? It means this is how we're going to negotiate with the world's largest sponsor of terror. Right? We're not going to get on TV and say, hey, guys, let's get together and find a solution. We're going to negotiate. We're going to continue to say, hey, we're going to continue to pound you. We're going to continue to meet our objectives. We're almost there. And of course, at the same time, the U.S. government is large. The State Department and other folks are surely having back discussions with Iran, either directly or indirectly. There's tons of reports. It's not that I have any inside information about that. It's out there. Those discussions are happening by all accounts. But that's not going to come out of the president's mouth. They're going to hear the president be strong and resolute.
And Fox News was reporting before the speech that he may talk about ground troops. And obviously that didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. So talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. I was thinking he was going to bring up the ground troops. It's something that has come up. There are ground troops that were sent to the region. There's lots of discussion from military analysts about the need for ground troops to go in and capture the uranium, et cetera, and different operations that you can't necessarily do from the air. But there's been a lot of political pushback domestically in the United States about the use of ground troops. Somehow politically, here in Israel as well, I think anywhere in the world in active combat, when things are happening from the air, there's sort of a comfort that our guys and girls are not going to get hurt or killed. And really, that's largely been the case. The numbers are every loss is horrible, but I don't want to get the number wrong. I believe we're at 16 Americans that were killed in this war, but none of them were shot down from the air. Actually, Pete Heck said that the Secretary of War had something really nice that came out yesterday, that the 3 pilots who were shot down in Kuwait by accident and they came down with parachutes, they were safe, were dropping bombs over Iran the night before, right? They were back in operations. I think that's the sense of aerial warfare, right? When the Air Force is doing what it's doing, it's going from the Navy, right, as opposed to boots on the ground. Whether or not we're going to do it, I think what the president understood was talking about it, making it sort of this public thing. The pushback internally is going to be too heavy. So whether or not the U.S. ends up using ground troops, I think it's still up in the air. Frankly, I think it's necessary for certain operations. We're not going back to Iran anytime soon. I don't think the U.S. has the wherewithal politically, right? I don't think they have it in their gut to continue a long war. That's not what the American people want. So if there can be targeted operations to make sure we actually finish the job, and next year we don't start having the same thing start again, whether or not there's a different regime holding office there, but we just don't want them to have any missiles, any uranium, or any capability to build those things to threaten the region.
And how would you compare Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Trump when it comes to their messaging on Iran? So, for example, I mean, Trump used the language of Stone Age, right? Whereas you and I understand that to mean the Iranian regime. Some people heard that, and he didn't really make that clear distinction. Whereas in terms of Israeli messaging in general, they really do an amazing job of making that distinction between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime.
Yeah. So, by the way, when he speaks about Stone Age, the way I read it, he's talking about infrastructure, because that's been the real question about the U.S. targets at this point. Is the U.S. going to target the electrical infrastructure, right? Just the infrastructure for their everyday life, and that's sort of the Stone Age angle. That's how I understood it to be. Someone's going to have to ask the president if that's what he meant, but I'm pretty sure that's what he was referring to. The Israeli people are much closer to this conflict than the American people, because I say we because we're here right now, but getting rockets and missiles every single day from Iran for the last 32 days. The Israeli people also, despite what anyone in the international media may want to say, or even some of the domestic left-wing media here would say, but the Israeli people are very supportive of the Iranian people. It's across the board. Everybody understands the difference between the Iranian people and the Iranian government. And in many times and in many instances, that's nonsense, right? In many instances, there's not a big distinction between the people and the government. The people support the government in countries all over the world. And so you're trying to make these distinctions. It's kind of like these things we'd say to make ourselves feel better. That's not the case in Iran, right? It's known that the majority of the Iranian people have Western values, don't want to be subjugated to the Iranian regime. I don't want to educate your listeners. This is your listeners know this better than anyone else. But the Israeli people definitely understand that, and it's critical for the Israeli people. And it's not because of any sort of PR effort that they're trying to make. If they want to have support for this war here in Israel, which they do, right, they have to be targeted as to what they're going after. And the targets that the Israelis are going after are military and political. They're going after the Iranian regime, period, and not the Iranian people.
Gabe, is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't touched on?
I think this is a monumental time. This is a biblical time for those of us who are religious, to think about what's happening, and just even from a political perspective, just to take a step back for a second and understand what is actually happening. To have the state of Israel, a small new Jewish nation, right, fighting alongside the United States of America against the Iranian regime, flying their jets side by side. It's something that we were speaking about last night in our family's Passover dinner, our Passover Seder, that it's something that we couldn't have dreamt of, not just 75 years ago or 80 years ago, but not even 5 or 10 years ago, that this could actually be happening. And that's the feeling that we have today in America and in Israel, that the United States and Israel are as strong as ever. And I'll end with this. I am a very optimistic person, and I know it's a hard thing to say 3 times today. Starting at 3:30 in the morning, I had to run to bomb shelters with my 5 children, okay, here in Jerusalem, and we're here just to celebrate the Passover holiday, okay? This is what they're dealing with every day. But what I'm absolutely confident about, from a political perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, from a military perspective, is that the next 10 to 20 years are going to be years of peace and prosperity in the Middle East, thanks to the operations that are happening today. And just having that understanding and that perspective really is what helps me. When you said, oh, you have a good attitude about it, that's where my mind is at. And I think it's critical for people to understand that perspective and know that the tomorrow is going to be better because of all of that is happening today.
Well, thank you so much. That's Gabe Groisman joining us today on Eye for Iran. Stay safe.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Islamic Republic's military and security forces are using schools and civilian spaces during wartime. The evidence was uncovered by my colleague, Azadeh Akbari, in her Iran International Special Report, and she joins us now. Thank you for being here, Azadeh.
Thanks so much for having me, Nego.
Of course, it's a pleasure. Paint us a picture, Azadeh. How many civilian sites are we talking about here? Where were they located? And what exactly were they being used for?
Yeah, so what our investigation found is that Iran's security forces moved weapons, personnel, and equipment into at least 70 civilian sites. Um, during the war with Israel and the United States. And these sites were spread across 17 provinces, so in 28 cities and 2 villages, which tells us that it is a nationwide pattern.
Well, and give us an idea, like kind of a behind the scenes look at how you came to this conclusion and the investigation in general.
Yeah, sure. So, one thing we did find was that out of all of those 70 locations, the biggest portion was schools as well. So that was 34
Terrific.
schools, which was shocking. Um, and in terms of the behind the scenes, I guess the reporting of it, so it started off, so it was built in layers. We started to gather eyewitness accounts. So people, just ordinary concerned Iranian citizens, uh, were messaging Iran International and telling us that, they're seeing security personnel, or, that moving into these sites or, moving their equipment in. Um, and started to record these messages thinking, it'd just be like maybe it's just an odd place, maybe it's an old school, but, yeah, so I started to collect them and it was over so we did it over a 13-day period. We started collecting the messages and the visual evidence that came through over a 13-day period. And we sort of stopped at 70 sites, because we could just go on and on and on, because these reports were, coming in. And what we did, I mean, another thing to remember as well is that there was a near total internet shutdown. So, it's very hard for people to send in, visuals. So videos or photos were quite scarce, but the messages were coming through, whether people were using VPNs or Starlink to send these messages. Um, so yeah, we started collecting them and you know, collecting all the messages, and the ones where, there was visual evidence, so whether it was a photo or, a video, we started geolocating them. So looking at actually where these places are exactly and mapping them out. And that's where we found that it's spread across the country, in these 17 provinces.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
pattern. I have a friend whose family member contacted her. They live in the Khuzestan region, and once the Israel and the U.S. bombed like some sort of missile site, the
mhm,
family member saw them then take everything into a pickup truck and go towards what she described as where she kind of had like a school summer camp, and they just started hiding it there.
yeah. Yep, I believe that now. Seeing, all these messages come through, and people were worried, when they were sending messages. I guess maybe one of the reasons why they were, sending these messages was, for us to, um, um, be able to, tell others and warn others to, stay away from these sites, I guess. But yeah, they were very, very concerned people.
And are these
Um,
sites that are used, also being used currently by civilians? Because are a lot of the schools now, I mean, are people attending school? Like how does this work in terms of their larger strategic um, strategy behind this, and also in terms of the impact that it's having on people and the harm that it puts people in?
yeah, I mean, it's I mean, the thing is, it's not just schools; it's hospitals as well, stadiums, parks. So it's it's a lot of different types of civilian sites. So the impact could be different depending on what's going on. It's hard to know, especially now with the internet, mm, you know being heavily filtered, and so we don't know. I guess we will find out.
Yeah, so
What
it's
will.
essentially using them as human shields, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're going into recreational sites, people are obviously, yes, there's a war, but people need to get outside, go to a park. People are sick. People are getting, cancer treatments still. I mean, there's life still goes on, right? And they're putting these civilians intentionally in harm's way, maybe hoping that the American and Israelis won't target those sites, right? As a result of it being civilian. But we saw that was a pharmaceutical site that was taken out recently, but according to the Israeli military, it was dual use and potentially had some connections to Iran's very secret uh, nuclear project SPND. And there was a lot of fentanyl being produced there. And yes, the fentanyl was being used in hospitals for people who need it, but at the same time, it was also being exported into this illicit global network.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing is that what happens is as soon as they move military personnel or equipment into a civilian site, they lose their protected status, so they can essentially become, legal military targets. Um, of course, the attacking force has to, give warning and keep in mind proportionality and all of that. But
But with a
um,
blackout, how are they gonna get the warning, right? I mean, so
exactly, exactly. So, we spoke to the IDF's Persian-speaking spokesperson, and they did say, they said, we are aware that this is happening, and what we do to, in light of this, what we emphasize is that, for people to stay away from these sites as soon as, if they are aware that, they are moving military equipment into civilian sites, they should stay clear of it. But also, um, watch out for our evacuation warnings. But, with the internet blackout, it becomes really, really hard.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
very sad. The Iranian people don't have what other countries have in terms of sirens and a regime that actually wants to protect you. They're doing the exact opposite. I recently reported on this young 11-year-old boy that was used in a
Yes.
military checkpoint. It's absolutely tragic, and of
Yes.
course he was killed in this airstrike, but he serves so many purposes for them, right? Because use them at a military checkpoint, use your kind of more sophisticated adult personnel for other bigger things, right? Because they are losing staff. It speaks to the sort of the shortages and problems that they're having there. And at the same time, he's a human shield. Use him for your propaganda purposes that, oh, look, they killed an 11-year-old child when it's you. I mean, the Iranian regime put him in harm's way to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, what we found as well is, with the majority of proportion of these sites being schools, so they were actually primary or elementary schools. So it puts the most at risk, population, children in harm's way.
It's really disgusting. Azadeh, what does this say to you about their wartime doctrine?
I think what this just shows is their complete and utter disregard for human life. So, they will go to any length to, you know, protect, their forces, um, and just absolutely, it's the same thing. It's been the same thing for the past 47 years. The Islamic Republic has not cared about Iranian people. And this is just another example of them showing complete disregard for human life.
Yeah, especially when people are at their most vulnerable state too, which makes it even more. Well, thank you so much for doing that important work. That's Azadeh Akbari of Iran International joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thank you so much, Groisman.
Well, if you like this episode, you can hit the like button and please leave us a comment, join the conversation, let us know what you think. You can also sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. And you can also check out our dedicated English website at iranintl.com/en.